It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. And I'm excited today because I have with me Greg Younger. He is the Write3 Guy. He's a leader in Web3 writing and literary NFTs who helps writers explore the blockchain. He's also host of the Write3 Show, which is a Twitter space every Tuesday at 3 Central. And he also has the Write3 podcast. Greg, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I've been following you on Twitter for a while, and I've subscribed to your newsletter, and I thought this is a great opportunity to explore the Write3 Guy, as well as to get into your podcast, which you've recently launched. So yeah, I'm pumped.
Me too. Excited. Let's do it.
Before we get to the podcast, and we will get there, what is the Write3 Guy, and what led you to become the Write3 Guy?
Sure. Right on. Well, the long story, trying to make it as short as possible, is that I was a financial advisor for a long time. And for about 20 years, I spent my days helping people save for retirement and send their kids to college. But I've always been a writer. I've always had blogs. I graduated with an English degree. And so it's always been something that I've done on the side. About a year ago, I had a good old-fashioned midlife crisis, I think is the easiest way to put it. And I sold my company. I sold my business. I said, this isn't fulfilling anymore. I had this revelation that we all have two lives, and the second one starts when you realize you only have one. And I decided to do something else, and becoming a full-time content creator is what I wanted to try out. And so I had been writing daily and writing about all kinds of topics. I'm a dad, I was a coach, mental health, and I was also talking about Web3. And the social signals that I was receiving was people like this Web3 writing. People are responding to it, they're engaging with it. And so I doubled down on Web3 writing. And essentially what I did was I said, hey, this is kind of ironic that so many people are building Web3 audiences using Web2 tools. And for those of us in the Web3 world, those of us who believe in decentralization and peer-to-peer internet and this kind of new wave of building audiences, it's ironic that there's so many people building on Web2 platforms. And so I went to start looking, how could I do this differently? How could I create content in a Web3 way? And quite frankly, there was not a lot of help. There wasn't a lot of people out there. There wasn't a lot of resources out there. And I just started producing my own. I spend most of my days trying out new things and looking to discover how to create content and write. And then I turn around and share that with my audience and help my fellow writers and content creators to use the blockchain and Web3 to create work. So I essentially sit at the intersection of writing and Web3, and I'm just having a blast doing it.
I love that description, sitting at the intersection of writing and Web3. I have been down the Web3 rabbit hole, understand a lot about what you're talking about. Some of the listeners may be a little unfamiliar with it. Would you share what makes Web3 unique and how it differs from Web2 or social media or other forms of content?
Yes, I will. And that is essentially the $1 million question, right? But what I try to remind my audience, people in my social circles that might ask the similar question, is this quote: if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And so social media platforms like TikTok or Facebook or Instagram that are free to use are mining your data at a very deep level. And Web3 intends to change that paradigm and create systems and platforms where they're not built on mining your data. They're built on a more organic and decentralized platform. And so that's the biggest difference. It's also this idea of owning versus renting. If we think about finance like I did for 20 plus years, I would always tell young people, buy a house, buy a house. It's a great investment because you own something. And then once you own something, you can leverage, you can build equity, you can buy and sell the asset. Whereas when you rent, you can't do any of that. And so, as we create content online, if we create a TikTok, we are renting space on TikTok's platform, but you don't own anything there. And so consequently, TikTok can stop you. They can censor you. They can do all sorts of things because you don't own the content. Whereas in Web3, we're trying, and we're not there yet, but trying is to create systems and platforms where we can take control and own the content that we're creating. And so the idea behind Web3 writing is then to own our work, own our audiences so that we can reward and engage our readers in a way that's never been done before.
I think it's a great description, and things that just come to mind talking about rewarding. This may take us down a rabbit trail, but talking about rewarding creators and authors, I think of the used bookstore marketplaces out there, right? You write a book and you may get something off the top, but that book can sell half a dozen more times easily and the author gets nothing. And so part of what you're talking about is not simply I'm throwing stuff up on Twitter, I'm throwing stuff up on TikTok, on YouTube, and it's not mine, but even hard stuff, right? Articles and books and art and other types of content. Am I tracking with you?
Absolutely. NFT books is a very good use case for what Web3 can be. And again, we're at the early stages, but the ebook on Amazon is not really a great medium for authors. Now, it's fantastic for the user. It's cheap, it's easy. You just go on Amazon and boom, you knock it out. But for the creator, it's not great. One, your cut is substantial that you have to give to Amazon. Two, you don't know who your buyers are. You just put it up there. People buy your stuff, but there's no way for me to know that Eric bought my work unless Eric tells me that he bought my work, right? And then for the user, again, it's easy, but you don't own your Amazon Kindle book. There's not a secondary market to sell it. My dad has probably 100 Kindle books in his Kindle, right? And he can't sell any of those. He can't really even lend them or share them. If he owns one and I say, hey, Dad, send me that book, it's a convoluted process and you really can't do it. So NFT books is there's all of these books being created. They're being created on chain, and secondary markets now exist where if you own it and you want to sell it to me, I can buy it from you. If you own it and want to give it to me, you can send it to me. You can lend it to me. You can lend it to me for money. There's all sorts of awesome ways that you can now engage and again, have this ownership model around your ebook where you never did before. And again, there's benefits from the creator's perspective and there's benefits from the reader's perspective, and it's all new. We're developing and building, and the user experience is not quite yet up to par with an Amazon Kindle. And so a lot of people will come and say, I don't care about all that stuff. I just want 2 clicks and I want to read it. That's fine. And that's okay. No worries. You be you, as I like to tell my kids. But we're trying to develop and think about things in a different way. Can we put some of this ownership online? Can we own the digital assets that we create and consume? And again, can we reward and engage our audiences like never before? And I'm confident Write3 can do it.
I agree. And that's one of the things, as I've been following you and trying to learn more about it, looking ahead at publishing, looking ahead at writing, even podcasts, the terms of audio and how to be able to really own that. Because as I think of content, especially online, there's 2 forms of content you really own are podcasts actually through podcasts, your website, and your email list. And even those with podcasts, you've got distribution and other stuff, but ultimately it's what you own. And so I appreciate you walking through that and thinking through that, because I think a lot of people in the world don't realize what you were talking about earlier. Social media, it's not theirs, right?
It really isn't. And to even challenge those three that you shared, do you even own your email list? MailChimp recently censored several large crypto newsletter lists. MailChimp basically came out and felt like crypto and Bitcoin was not the type of content that they wanted on their platform. And so they shut them down. They said, nope, you can't use MailChimp. Twitter recently shut down their newsletter Review. And for a while, I don't even know, I think this is now gone past, but for a week to 10 days, users couldn't access their email lists. So do you own it, or does really Twitter own it? That becomes the question on some of our email lists. So again, a benefit of Web3 is these ideas of wallets. If you have a digital crypto wallet, that wallet is decentralized. You own your wallet, you own your wallet address. And if you've provided that wallet address to me, you and I have a communication portal that is immutable. It cannot be censored. It cannot be interrupted. As long as I have internet and you have internet, we'll always be connected till the end of time. And that's not necessarily the case for emails. So again, a bit of a rabbit hole. A lot of people are just like, well, I don't care. That doesn't apply to me. And that's okay. We're at the beginning of this. I believe that my kids will care a lot about owning their digital assets and will want to be owners and not renters. I think our generation, it comes and goes. Some will get it, some won't.
I agree. I think it's an education thing. It's an early adopter thing. It's a mindset thing, but it's coming. And there's a lot of good stuff happening from it. And so as you have begun this content journey, and I'm realizing you and I could talk for hours just on blockchain and Web3 and IP and all kinds of stuff. But as you jumped on your content journey, what is something, a benefit, something fun that's happened that you just totally didn't expect?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is a bit of a vanity metric, but my kids think it's cool, which is the Web3 world has a lot of intersection with entertainment. I think the idea around Web3 is a real democratization around the creative process. And Hollywood is a top-down industry. And even creators who get to the highest rank will look around and say, I'm here, I'm at the top, but I really want to empower everyone. I want to democratize Hollywood. And so Web3 has a lot of Hollywood and entertainers. And so I have been able to converse and connect with entertainers that I just never would have thought, or at least with their teams. And it's truly amazing sometimes the rooms and the meetings that I get asked to come into. And I'm like, whoa, this is pretty wild. So there's definitely been some entertainment and Hollywood connections that sometimes blow my mind. On a more practical basis, I've recently kind of gone through this process of creating digital assets and creating my own NFTs and airdropping those to collectors of my writing. And if you've never gifted and rewarded a collector through an airdrop, it's an awesome feeling. It's just a really cool feeling to say thank you by being able to gift something that I think is worth something that I've created, something that's a digital asset that is only owned by a few people. And to be able to give it to somebody as a thank you really is cool. It's a cool feeling. I highly recommend it for anyone who is out there creating content.
Now, both of those things would be fascinating and unexpected, just the people you get to talk to. But I agree that the being able to serve a community and just be of benefit and help and just being able to take care of them in some capacity is huge.
It's fun, right? I mean, that's Web3 is well known for community building. It's well known for being a fantastic place for communities to come together around a common good. And the common good for a lot of people are those digital assets that people own. People get fired up about it. This is what we know about ownership, right? When you own something or a piece of something, you begin to care. If you own an individual security, let's say Apple, and then you have the option to go buy a new phone, what are you going to do? You're going to buy an iPhone or an Android? Well, you're a stockholder at Apple. You're probably going to go buy an iPhone, right? So ownership has always influenced behavior. And so what NFTs and crypto allow is for an ownership into a group or into a community. And once you have even a tiny bit of ownership, you become involved, you become engaged, you become a proponent because you have ownership. And back to the real estate, one of the downsides of being a rental landlord is the upkeep of property. If you've ever owned a rental, you know that your rentees don't always take care of their house because it's not theirs, right? It's just renting. And so the same thing happens with Web 2, social media. Why are we on Twitter? Why are we on LinkedIn? I mean, as long as they're giving us what we need, we'll stay. As soon as they stop giving us what we need, we'll leave. We don't care, right? Renting land. And what NFTs and crypto and Web3 are saying, oh, here's a chance to own something. And once you own it, become ingrained with whatever that project or platform is. Does that make sense?
It does. And I agree. That's one of the cool things with some of the projects out there. And that's kind of how we ended up initially connecting, was through Lazy Lions, which is a neat project out there. And it's like suddenly everything lion related suddenly becomes pertinent.
Sure, it does. Absolutely, right? We care about that project. We care about the success of that project. We have that in common. And we take ownership, right, in what's happening. And so our connection to that particular project is deeper than just about anything else that I'm a part of.
Yeah, I agree. And it was unexpected in the whole process of it. It's like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's an additional benefit of the ownership of the property rights.
Exactly. Digital property rights.
Yeah. Yeah. As you started on this journey with content, with Write3, were you always thinking you would start a podcast, or was that just an afterthought? How did that come about?
Here's what I know, or what I knew, is if I'm going to sell my business, have a midlife crisis, and start creating content, then I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to do what's fun. This is the opportunity to do what I enjoy doing. And so when I look at writing and I look at podcasts, or I look at making videos, all of the different ways that you can create content, the thing I love to do most is that interview podcast thing. And, if you think about it, for 20 years, I would have chats, not unlike the one we're having, 4 to 5 times a day. If there's one thing that I've done 1,000 times over, is talk to people and chat with them and engage and listen and make a human connection. And it was the part of the job that I actually loved. And so when I really sat back and said, okay, well, you can do anything that you want. What do you want to do? And podcasting was at the very high on the list. But as you and I were talking about before, the podcast world is hard. It's tough. It's a difficult place to make your mark. And so what I thought about it, and not to say that my journey is the correct one, but I've had some success with this idea or this mental model, which is go start where you can get the quickest feedback loop. When I started creating content, I wasn't always talking about Web3 writing. I started by talking about being a dad. I started talking about being a youth coach, a youth athletic coach, which I had done for 10 years. I like bonsai trees and had been creating some content around bonsai. I was doing all kinds of stuff to see what I liked and what sticked. And by using like a Twitter or even like an Instagram, you're going to get a feedback loop very quick. Whereas if you're doing a podcast once a week or even 5 minutes every other day, it could be tough to start getting feedback, especially if you're writing and talking about the same thing each time. You can't really do any type of A/B testing. You can't put out, I mean, you can, right? But it's kind of weird, right? To start a podcast and day one, you're talking about 5 ways to raise 3 growing boys. And then 2 days later, how to trim your bonsai. People will be like, this is the weirdest podcast I've ever come across. Whereas on Twitter, you could do that, right? You could one day wake up and write this and then write something else. And then a month later, you can look at the social signals, right? You can see how, wow, this Web3 stuff is getting a ton of action. And by the way, nobody cares about your bonsai trees. And so, although I knew I wanted to do a podcast, I knew that at least early on, if I really wanted to get into content creation and try to monetize it at some point, I needed that quick feedback loop that Twitter gave me. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense because you iterated in various capacities, you tested the market, you started getting feedback. It's like, okay, here's my niche, because that's what you really need for a podcast or really need for long-term content. So yeah, you were just trying to narrow it down and then you landed on it.
Right, exactly. And then the next step for me was Twitter Spaces. And, for those that might not be familiar with what a Twitter Space is, it's essentially very easy, spinnable audio room that can be created in just a couple of steps right from your cell phone if you want. It is a very low friction process. And one thing I think about a lot is friction and how important it is to create content for your audience and then reduce friction as much as possible. So again, if I'm creating content on Twitter and I'm getting a lot of people on Twitter saying, man, I really like this guy. I like this work. I want to follow what he's saying. And then I throw out a link to my podcast. Now I've created friction, right? I've asked them to leave the platform that they came for and go to another platform. And Twitter and other social media platforms don't really like it either because they want you to stay on their platform. They don't want you going to Spotify or wherever. By talking and using a Twitter space, there's a lot of benefits. One, Twitter is going to not only like it, but they're going to actually help you engage. If you tweet out, hey, I'm going to be doing this Twitter space, you'll find the algorithm is like, good, okay, let's throw that in front of a bunch of people, right? So you've already got your core audience in Twitter. They don't have to go anywhere. They can pop it open. They can actually stay on Twitter doing what they usually do, and the audio is in the background. So that, it's a very low friction way to sort of start getting your podcast feet wet. And the other great thing is it's great practice. Twitter spaces are very laid back. They're inherently laid back. You could be walking your dog while being the space's host, and it can be as laid back as you want it to be. And so one of the things that I would say is that it gave me an opportunity to practice, try new things, do all kinds of fun ideas, and again, build up this audience of folks who like coming on every week and chatting about my particular niche, which is Web3 writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then, so low friction, and I agree, low friction is important for any content, any product. You have to make it easy for people to get it. And as you're going through this, is it just conversations? Are you doing Twitter spaces and doing interviews, inviting people in to have a conversation? What's that format?
To be sure, Twitter allows you to do anything. And honestly, the most successful Twitter spaces are often panels, large panels of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people talking about some sort of a subject that is appealable to a massive audience. If you're trying to drive a Twitter space to its highest reach, something like that is the formula. For me, I did always have the podcast in mind. This is the way that I wanted to do it. I'm less concerned about maximizing the space's reach as I am just doing what I want to do. Part of being a content creator is sometimes just deciding I want to do what I want to do. I do a more of an interview process, and I reach out to friends and, again, connections, interesting Write3 topics and people. And I have a Write3 show, which is hopefully somewhat self-explanatory in the sense that I'm going to bring people on and we're going to talk about Web3 writing in some capacity. And so that's the way that I do it. I have the same slot every week. It's Tuesday afternoons here in the United States at 3:00 Central. We have the Write3 show. I try to keep it to about an hour. I bring on guests or interesting topics with panels, so to speak. But for the most part, it's a very podcast feel to it. Introduce myself, introduce what I'm all about, get into, if you've ever been on any of my Write3 shows, you'll know that I have a very sort of podcasty interview style where we're asking about your story and what you're building or what you're doing. Not unlike the conversation you and I are having right now.
Now you've launched your podcast.
Right.
And so you created content, you did it through Twitter primarily, you launched spaces because that's where your audience and your community were located. Now you've taken another step and you're launching a podcast, which was at the forefront of your mind at the beginning, but now you're like, I think I've got enough groundswell to be able to do that. What benefits are you hoping to get from the podcast besides just the joy of making it? Because some people don't like doing podcasts and they definitely don't want to do the conversations. I find them fun. And so I get the enjoyment factor. But what other benefits are you looking to get from it?
I hear you. I mean, just a side note, somebody recently sent out a tweet and said, some of the Twitter spaces that I love, and answered, and I was humbled enough to be a part of that list. And a little bit farther down, another spaces person sort of chimed in and said, oh, thank you. I'm sorry I haven't been doing spaces lately. Quite frankly, they just wear me out. And I thought to myself, just stop. Like, life is too short, right? I mean, these things should not wear you out. And if they wear you out, then my suggestion is go create content that doesn't wear you out. That is why we quit our 9-to-5s and become content creators, is to do things that doesn't wear us out. So yes, I love them. They're the highlight of my week. I thoroughly enjoy them. So why did I then go to a podcast? I'm now getting the social signals. I'm getting the data. There's a real practical issue now, which is I'm doing this for like 3 or 4 months. I think about 4 months, because I had 16 episodes. And by the way, if you're going to do a Twitter space, just make sure you click the record button. It's arguably the most important thing. You do it at the beginning, you hit record. That way, the audio is yours. And so what I did from the very beginning, from the very first show, was I was recording and then downloading that audio onto my computer. And that's important because Twitter only stores your audio for a limited amount of time. So at the time of this recording, I think it's 60 days. So in 60 days, your fantastic conversation that you had in a Twitter space is gone. You'll never see it again. So there becomes this like practical issue where people will ask you, hey, how do you mint and publish a book as an NFT? And you want to say to them, oh, that's a great question. I actually talked about this for an hour on a Twitter space. You should check that out. And then you realize, oh, no, I can't actually send that audio because it's gone. So I knew practically that I wanted to be able to store what I feel is a wealth of knowledge and learning and understanding that we can really sort of draw back to. I mean, the whole idea behind becoming a content creator is the compounding effect of our content, right? What you're creating today will have benefit tomorrow and may even have more benefit 6, 9, 12 months from now. But if you're going to build a Twitter space portfolio, you can't do it. So step one is, let's just take this audio and let's throw it into a podcast, because then we know that we can just have a library of that information. The second reason for me was and is that, I'm getting enough social signals that this is interesting. This is a niche. This is information that people want to hear about and are asking themselves on a rather regular basis, which is, hey, what could Web3 writing look like? Who is doing Web3 writing well? Who is leading the Web3 literary NFT movement? And not all those people are on Twitter. Or if they are, they're probably like a real human and they're not on there every day. They have like lives. They have like a 9 to 5, right? So part of this is about now broadening Write3 to a larger audience. And we know that a podcast can start to take us away from a Twitter audience and broaden us to a larger audience. So what makes Twitter great is the moat that it has. People on Twitter like Twitter and the Twitter products, but that same moat means that all of your content isn't getting seen by another splice of the world. And the other benefit to taking a Twitter space and turning it into a podcast is now we get to share the Write3 story with a larger audience.
I think that is brilliant. It sounds like what you're doing is at the very beginning, you hit record. At the end, you stop recording. You then download your file, and then you basically throw an intro and an outro on it. Then you upload it. I'm painting with a big brush, and then that's your podcast episode. Is that correct?
As of right now, yes, that is what we're doing. And the third reason that I wanted to start a podcast, after just wanting to get the word out of there, building the right and not being able to access old conversations on Twitter. The other reason was that I have 3 boys, and it is actually really important to me that I get my kids involved in what I'm doing. That's a sort of like a value of mine. And so my 16-year-old, who is like many 16-year-olds, is a gamer and doesn't really care a whole lot about what's happening in the real world. And that's okay. But I knew that he had the ability to edit and slice and dice videos and audio, because that's what he does with gaming. He does similar things all the time. And so part of this process too was to get my son involved as a producer and get him involved with understanding how to create and produce a podcast, everything from the audio, but also over time, the show notes and even the booking of the guests. This is something he can do. This becomes a real world skill that he can now put on a resume and say, oh, I might not have done anything, but I have been a podcast producer for a few years, which, as you know, as somebody in the podcast world, is not an insignificant piece of experience. And so he is my video and audio editor. And so, yes, we download, I use on a Mac, I use something called Audio Hijack, and I'd be happy to share these tools with you, and you can put in the show notes, but I download onto Audio Hijack. And then my son, I believe, uses like a DaVinci Resolve, which again is, I think, more of a video editing, but it works just fine for audio as well. I tape a few minutes of intro. And again, I'll be honest with you, I'm just practicing these. I'm trying to see what works for me and what I feel like the audience wants. But yes, I'm doing some sort of an intro saying, hey, this was the guest. This is what we talked about. These were 1 or 2 things that I really enjoyed about it. I hope you enjoy. And then boom, you're right into it. And at this point, we're not doing a lot of editing, but we could, right? We could edit down the audio of the space, but we're really not. And again, another reason for that is low friction. If you're going to be either a content creator full-time like I am, or even as a side gig, yeah, doing things efficiently is important, right? So does it make sense right now for us to spend 2.5 hours editing and caring a ton about the polish? I don't think so. My very first podcast, I quoted one of the co-founders of LinkedIn who said, if you're not completely embarrassed by the first version of your product, you shipped too late. And I love that. And I believe in that. And so is the Write3 podcast that you can download in January of 2023 polished, look at how podcasting can be done? Absolutely not. But is it out there? Is it starting to evolve? Is it the first draft of what we are hoping to ship? Absolutely. And to me, as a content creator, that's what I believe. Action, over everything. And so that's what we're doing, and that's where we're at.
Now, and that makes perfect sense, because as we were talking earlier about, sometimes it's about shipping the product. At some point, good is good. Perfect is the enemy of good. And so sometimes it's just getting it out there. And one of the things I've noticed with podcasts is it's okay that there's some ums and ahs. It's okay that you don't have like crystal clear audio. It's because it's conversational and people don't expect it. You can have some bumps and some things go on, and it just sort of rolls right off. So perfect audio is not a requirement. At the same time, you're like, hey, we're just going to iterate. We're going to try some things, and we'll just get better at it, which that's a freedom thing for anybody who's thinking about it.
Absolutely. Right. And again, you don't have to start with a podcast. You can start with Twitter Spaces and figuring out what works and what doesn't work and what you like and what your audience likes. And as long as you're hitting record, you're building up a library that you can publish later. The other thing now is there's a particular guest that I've been chasing for the Write3 show, and he lives in Berlin and is unable to make my afternoon spaces. And as a matter of fact, I asked him 2.5 months ago to come on, and he said, no, I can't make that space. And so we're going to do a podcast. I'm going to do an actual podcast. We're not going to do the space. I'm going to do an interview. I feel very confident that it'll work because I've done it so much, right? I've done the interview process before. I know what it wants to look like or how I want it to be presented. And we're going to do a sort of a podcast lead. And so over time, who knows? Maybe we don't do the spaces anymore, and now we're doing more of a podcast. But it's all about the flexibility. It's about doing it. It's about having the information out there. And then ultimately, right, and this because I think this is what you're doing. You've got a great niche. Someone like myself who's just starting to podcast needs all the resources they can to try to figure out how to do this. And so the same is for me. I have a niche of people who want to hear this conversation with this guest, right? We know that there's an audience for it. And so, it's just like anything else. If you can establish the audience first, then it gives purpose to your content. And then that's what drives content creation and audience building.
Completely agree. Is there anything you wish you knew ahead of time before you started this? Or is it like, I knew enough to just take the first step? Or how's that journey been?
Oh man, it's like everything else. I mean, it feels so overwhelming. I don't know how else to say it. It feels insurmountable is the word that I think I feel. Because what I'll do is I'll have a conversation, or I'll listen to something like this, and I got some alpha male telling me to do it, and it's easy, and run 5 miles and drink an egg for breakfast and then go do your podcast, get off your ass, right? That's sort of the alpha male content creation world, right? And you're like, all right, I'm going to go do this. And then you stare it in the face, right? You do a couple of Google searches and you're just literal, paralysis by analysis. So that's how I feel about everything. I mean, I want to be really clear as a content creator. I don't know what I'm doing most of the time. But what I would just say is I think I have gotten to a point in being present and recognizing that feeling, and that, okay, I've gotten over this before. So just take a deep breath and let's start figuring this out. And what's fun is my 16-year-old is a whiz at all kinds of stuff. And that's an awesome experience to sit down with him and try to figure out things together. And of course, that generation they grew up on the internet in a way that no one else has. And so it's so intuitive to them to find answers. And so I guess I'm not sure. I mean, there's a whole list of things that I wish I knew ahead of time, Eric, right? I mean, a whole list. But I guess if the way I feel like I can better answer that is to try to be as real as I can and just say that I don't know. And I just had to kind of figure stuff out. And my hope is that like each iteration is better than the last. For example, I don't have an outro as of today, but we're going to work on that and add that to the next one. And so, again, it's this idea of just shipping it, seeing what works, seeing what sticks, and then, just knowing that each time I do something, I don't really have to redo that ever again. I've got it figured out. And so that's it. And look, there was 3 or 4 people who were just so helpful and instrumental in telling me and helping me out. And so, that's the thing. And believe me, you want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to be that person for somebody else. And so that's how we do it, right? We have to just sort of reach out and get help. And without those people, I wouldn't be here. And so that's what you got to do. You just got to get out there and try your best and overcome.
I agree. It's all about the repetitions. It's the reps. It's about doing it. It improves over time, and just giving yourself permission to just go for it, which is hard because I know me personally is I get that people-pleasing perfectionist sort of, for too many years. And it's like, oh, I can't do it because it's not perfect. Well, you can't get to version 100 until you put in the first 99, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question. I mean, absolutely. And that's what we have to remind ourselves, is that the creators that we admire are on step 2000 and we are on step 10. And if you were to go back and look at their step 10, it's not a whole lot better or worse than your step 10. Repetition will beat ability any day. Just you got to wake up and continue to create. And if you enjoy the podcast medium, again, getting back to this idea that like if it's wearing you out, you're probably not going to continue. But if you enjoy it the way that you and I do, then you'll be fine. And that's all we can do.
Now, as we kind of wrap up here, any takeaways you'd like to leave our audience?
Well, what I would just say from a content creation perspective, and I wrote about this actually this morning, is I think that we all can, myself included, have this paralysis by analysis as it applies to creating content. We often we struggle with the idea of why create. There's so many other people creating. Why is anybody going to read our stuff or consume our content? I don't want to waste time becoming a content creator and then nobody read my stuff. Or, what if I'm reading or creating the wrong niche? I don't want to wake up 6, 9, 12 months from now and think, man, I picked the wrong topic. What a waste of a year. And so I'm just not going to do anything. I can't win. And so I'm not going to do anything. And what I wrote about this morning is that I'm a mountain climber. I've got a good buddy of mine. We climb mountains together. And what I told him recently when he expressed those concerns with me, I said, we can't worry about whether or not we're climbing the right mountain. We just need to be focused on being the best mountain climbers we can be. if we have the tools and the resources to know how to climb mountains, we can climb pretty much any mountain in the world. And so the same thing applies to your content creation. Don't worry about whether or not you're creating the right content, or don't worry if you're in the right niche. Just focus on creating content and congratulate yourself for building up the skills of being a content creator. I created a podcast. That's amazing. That is great. I can use that skill for the rest of my life. I have now done it. I have a newsletter. I've built that skill. I'm a better writer. I've created and built a Twitter following. These are all things that I've done over the last 6 months that will be usable no matter what happens in the future. And so I have no idea whether this idea of Write3 will ever take off. I don't. I have no idea if Write3 is going to work, if my content's going to work, if my branding's going to work. I have no idea if I'm going to make any money doing this. That's for sure. But it's hard for me to look back at the last year and say, oh, what a waste of time. It's absolutely not been a waste of time. Not at all. It's been an enormously valuable learning period for me over the last year, because I've focused on the skills and the resources that I need to become a content creator. And so if you're listening to this podcast and you're wondering, I want to do a podcast, but I don't know what to do, don't worry about it. Just do it. Just ship it. Just focus on being a mountain climber, not whether or not you're climbing the right mountain.
I agree. You don't know it until you get in it and try it, and you just start messy and you just improve. As we wrap up, if our listeners want to know more about you, about your podcast, your Twitter Spaces, your newsletter, where would you like them to go?
The easiest place to do is to go to Twitter, follow me at Greg Younger. And there I have a Linktree to all of my stuff. I'll be sure to give you links to the newsletter and the podcast and my work on Mirror that can be collected in the show notes so that people can see the Linktree. But Twitter is my hub at the moment. That's where 90% of my content comes from. And if you give me a quick follow there, you'll find everything that you need.
Excellent. So at Greg Younger on Twitter, we will put all of that information in the show notes. So if you want to check him out, you can. I would encourage you to do so. He is doing some really neat stuff in this space. So Greg, thank you for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
It's been awesome. Thank you. And I wish you and this podcast all the success in the world. And I appreciate you having me on.
If you want to learn more about how to use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence, make sure to sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the show notes. Also, we'll be launching a course later this spring with more information to come. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can DM me on Twitter at rfordej or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.